How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Pei Zayin, Daf 87 of Masechta Zevachim, friends. Okay, friends. Oh, sheesh. Oh boy. Daf Pei Zayin. Ooh. Well, I think yesterday. I think I said yesterday was a technical daf. I think today's is another one. Yeah, but it'll be great. I mean, Masechta Zevachim, hey? Okay, well, the first section of Daf Pei Zayin of Masechta Zevachim discusses Shrirei limbs not on the pyre at midnight. Okay, sheesh. Yesterday we saw, I believe it was a Mishnah, that limbs of an ola that are burning, so up until midnight, if they get off of the pyre, you got to put it back on the pyre. After midnight, you can already consider them to be ash. We're going to talk about what if it popped off of the pyre before midnight, but then you only put it back on the pyre after midnight. Okay, exciting times here. So that is the first section of today's daf. Second section is if there is linah at the top of the mizbeach. Okay, interesting questions. If you have limbs of an ola, let's say at the top of the mizbeach, not burning, and they're there all night. Of course, there's the concept of linah in the azara. If you have, let's say, the limbs of an ola are just hanging out in the azara, they were never put on the mizbeach. Comes the morning, they are going to be psul bilina. But what if they were on the mizbeach, not on the pyre, not burning, but at the top of the mizbeach? Is there a concept of linah, and what are the nafkaminas if there are or aren't? Section number 3 of Daf Pei Zayin, Klei is being meqadesh psuls. Okay, if you have psuls stuff, of course, we learned in the Mishnah the other day that im alu lo yerdu, right? By many psulin, once they are brought to the top of the mizbeach, okay, you can leave them there. So what if those kinds of psuls were in a klei and were meqadesh? Right? A klei is meqadesh, that which goes in a klei. What is it? Maybe I think is what the pasuk says. So choose. I have it right in front of me. It says yeah, that klei is meqadesh, whatever goes into it. So the question is, would a klei be meqadesh these psuls things to the extent that now they are mutter and kosher lechatchila to put them on the mizbeach? All right, we'll have to see. And finally, the air. This is really going to be essentially Pei Zayin Amud Beis, is a discussion of the airspace of the mizbeach. Of course, we said that the mizbeach is meqadesh esa ro'ila, that which is fit for it. What about its airspace? That if something is not resting on the mizbeach itself, but in the airspace of the mizbeach, is that considered like the mizbeach itself or not? So, Chaver, these are the topics that we have ahead of us on Daf Pei Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. Very, I think the vibe here in the introduction was kind of like very technical sugyas over here, but I'm sure it'll be great. So, friends, without further ado, let's jump in to Daf Pei Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, we are going to begin on Daf Pei Vav Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Idmar was stated, Pershu kodem chatzos v'echzirin acher chatzos. Rabba Amar chatzos sheni ochalton, Rav Chizda Amar amud hashachar ochalton. Oh boy. So, okay, as I mentioned in the introduction, so we had learned in the Mishnah yesterday that, let's see, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah had said, I'm reading the Mishnah now, Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph. Ivarim shepaku me'algabim mizbeach. If you have limbs of a korban ola that popped off of the pyre, so kodem chatzos yachzir. Okay, so if this happened before midnight, so take the limb and put it back on the pyre. And there is still a din me'ila, right? This is up until midnight. Take the limb, put it back on the mizbeach, and you still can't get any benefit from this limb. And if you do, there's me'ila. Le'acher chatzos, but after midnight, lo yachzevei malin boin, you don't need to put it back on the pyre, you can already consider the limb to be ashes, to be deshen, and there's no longer any din me'ila. We had said in the Gemara that this is talking about Shrirei, right? Because if it's talking about a limb that still has meat on it, that there's still raw meat on it, so then even after chatzos, you're going to have to put it back on the pyre. It needs to continue burning. If this is a limb that's already entirely ash, well then even before chatzos, it's already entirely ash. There's nothing that you need to still burn. So this is talking about what the Gemara called Shrirei. This is what's called Shrirei, which are limbs that are somewhere in between. They're not quite ash, but there's also no meat left on them. So if they popped off of the pyre before midnight, so we said put it back on the pyre, and there is still a din me'ila at this point for these Shrirei. If it's after midnight, however, we said that we would consider it to be deshen, ash, and there is no din me'ila. Now, the interesting thing is, what if, so just to get back to what we were saying a second ago, so if you have a Shrirei that pops off of the pyre before chatzos, okay, so now you take it and you put it back on the pyre, and now it's after chatzos, and let's say it pops off again. Well, at this point, it's already considered it's post chatzos, meaning when it popped off before chatzos, you put it back on the pyre. Now it pops off again post chatzos. Well, at this point, it's just considered ash. Now, what happens, however, in a scenario where the Shrirei popped off of the pyre before chatzos? So the halacha is, well, you have to put it back on the pyre. There's a din me'ila, etc. But you didn't do that for whatever reason. You didn't put it back on the pyre. But now it's after chatzos. So now what happens? So now it's after chatzos, right? Because if it was on the pyre at chatzos, well then the clock strikes 12 and it turns to ash. Even though it's still Shrirei, it turns to ash at chatzos. But it wasn't on the fire though. It wasn't on the fire at chatzos. If it was on the fire, then it would be considered ash at that point. But it wasn't on the fire. It had popped off the fire before chatzos, and at its last status, it had to be returned to the pyre, and pyre use them interchangeably, the pyre of the fire. So the last status was that it had to be returned to the fire, and that there was a din me'ila. And if you would have done that, then comes chatzos, clock strikes 12, it would have now been considered deshen, but you didn't return it to the pyre. So now what happens? So again, Idmar was stated, Pershu Kodem Chatzos, if the Shrirei popped off the pyre before Chatzos, Vechziran Acher Chatzos, and at Chatzos they were still off the fire, and they were only returned to the fire after Chatzos. So now what happens? It missed the 12 o'clock, let's call it deadline, for it to be able, I feel like deadline is not the right word, but I'm probably going to just work with it. It missed kind of that, or cutoff I think is a better word. It missed the 12 o'clock cutoff for 12 o'clock to make it, to consider it to be ash. So so now what happens? So Rabba Amar Chatzos Sheni Ochaltim. So Rabba says, well, tomorrow night at Chatzos, make sure that the Shrirei is on the pyre, and if it's on the pyre, tomorrow night at Chatzos, clock strikes 12, this Shrirei will finally be considered ash, if it isn't yet already ash. Right? Meaning, because once already it's burning on the mizbeach, right? If you're wondering why would it still be there tomorrow night? Well, once it's burning on the mizbeach, you keep it burning on until it's finished burning, or right until it's either ash or until you can consider it to be ash. This Shrirei, we can't consider it to be ash until tomorrow night at Chatzos, according to Rabbah. Of course, if before then the fires turn it into ash, well then it will be ash by then. Once it's ash, it's ash. Rav Chizda Omer says, Rav Chizda Omer HaShachar Chatan. Rav Chizda says, however, that comes Omer HaShachar, if the Shrirei are on the pyre, comes Omer HaShachar, Amud HaShachar will allow us to consider the Shrirei to be ash. So it says of Chisda, even if you missed the midnight cutoff, Amud HaShachar is another cutoff since in this case, the Shrirei were put back on the pyre post Chatzos, before Amud HaShachar, comes Amud HaShachar according to Rav Chisda, and we can at that point consider the Shrirei to be ash. And there's no longer Me'ila or anything like that. Amir Bey Rav, they said in the Bismedrash of Rav, Tosfos Taka points out references to Gemara in Sanhedrin that we learned in Daf Yomi Zevachim, that Amir Bey Rav is Rav Huna, which is an interesting question because it wasn't Rav Huna, Rav Chisda's Rebbe. Why would Rav Chisda's Rebbe be explaining his words? But anyways, Amir Bey Rav, they said by the Bismedrash of Rav, my time of Rav Chisda, how come Rav Chisda says that Alos HaShachar can allow us to consider the Shrirei to be ash? The reason is umachatzos she'ein ose linah ose ikul. Well, because if midnight is able to allow us to consider the Shrirei to be ash, and midnight can't even make things into linah. It's less stringent in that sense. Right? Amud HaShachar is more stringent in that. Comes Amud HaShachar, if there are, let's say, limbs of the Ola that were sitting on the Azara floor and never were brought up to the mizbeach all night, comes Amud HaShachar, comes the morning, and now those limbs are psuls b'linah. Chatzos, midnight doesn't have that koach, is less stringent in that sense. Any limbs that are not on the mizbeach yet, come midnight, no problem. Just make sure to get them on the mizbeach by Amud HaShachar. So now if midnight, which is more lenient in that, comes midnight, any limbs not yet on the mizbeach are totally kosher, and yet it has the power, Chatzos has the power to allow us to consider Shrirei to be consumed, well then certainly Amud HaShachar, which is more stringent, it's more powerful, it has the koach to allow us, it has the koach to make limbs not yet on the mizbeach be considered psuls b'linah, certainly then it should also be able to allow us to consider Shrirei to be considered consumed if they are on the pyre, come Amud HaShachar. I better drink a little water. So let's read that again. Amir Bey Rav, they said by the Bismedrash of Rav, my time of Rav Chisda, how come Rav Chisda says that Amud HaShachar can allow us to consider the Shrirei to be considered consumed? Umachatzos she'ein osin linah, that comes chatzos, limbs that are not yet on the mizbeach, no problem, they're still kosher, they're not psuls b'linah, and yet ose equal chatzos has the koach to allow us to consider Shrirei to be consumed. Amud HaShachar she'ose linah, so Amud HaShachar, which is more powerful in the sense that it makes things psuls b'linah, makes limbs that are not yet on the mizbeach psuls b'linah. Eno din she'ose equal. Certainly, it should allow us to consider Shrirei to be consumed. Now, the Gemara asks, okay, what if the Shrirei popped off of the mizbeach, popped off of the pyre before chatzos, and were not put back on the mizbeach by chatzos, nor were they put back on the mizbeach by Amud HaShachar either. They were only put back on the mizbeach after Amud HaShachar, which means that it missed the Amud HaShachar deadline as well, cut off as well. So Perishu Kodim Chatzis, if the Shrirei popped off of the pyre before Chatzos, V'echzirun la'achar Amud HaShachar, and they were only returned to the pyre post Amud HaShachar. Rabba Amar Chatzos Sheni Ochaltam. So Rabba says, okay, same thing as before. Comes midnight tomorrow night, and as long as the Shrirei are on the pyre come midnight tomorrow, they'll be considered consumed, even if they aren't already yet ash. Rav Chizda Omar ein boen equal le'elam, says Rav Chizda, well, in this case, you missed both cutoffs. You missed chatzos, right, when it popped up before chatzos, you missed putting it back on by chatzos, you missed putting it back on by Omer HaShachar, you don't have any more cutoffs, and you're just going to have to keep on burning it and burning it and burning it until it just becomes ash. Maskiv Rav Yosef asakasha uman lema lan de chatzos birosh mizbeach meshavya lehu equal. How do we know that the limbs would have to be at the top of the mizbeach comes midnight for us to consider them to be consumed? De mashkicha lu mishavilu equal. Rav Yosef says, one second, why do I need the Shrirei to be on the pyre come midnight in order for them to be consumed? Who cares? Kilu. We're not talking about limbs that have meat on them. Right, as we said already yesterday, if they had meat, then you would have to burn them until all the meat is gone. We're talking about these limbs that are consumed but not yet fully ash. Why do they dafka have to be on the pyre for them to be considered consumed? Why don't we just say, comes midnight, clock strikes 12, wherever they are, Shrirei will be considered consumed. All Shrirei of tonight's korbanos, of today's korbanos, come chatzos, they're considered consumed wherever they are. Why do they have to be dafka on the top of the pyre? What difference does that make? Why can't we just say that what we're saying is that when it comes to Shrirei, comes midnight, there's no longer a din me'ila. There will still be, as we're going to see in a second, there will still be also midrabban. If it wasn't on the pyre, comes midnight, midrabban, and you shouldn't get benefit from it. So if you have this lid, this Shrirei that popped off of the pyre before midnight, and we're saying that you have to put it back, and there's a din me'ila. If you didn't put it back, so comes midnight, there's no longer din me'ila, but you still shouldn't get benefit from it. Okay, but again, if Yosef asks, Uman lema lan de chatzos boshem mizbeach meshavile lu equal. Says of Yosef, why do the Shrirei davka have to be at the top of the mizbeach in order for them to be considered consumed? Why can't we just say, why can't we just say that when it comes to Shrirei, wherever they are, comes midnight, clock strikes 12, they're considered consumed. They sent from Eretz Yisrael to Babble. Taka the halacha is like Rav Yosef, he hit the nail on the head. Itmanami was also stated on Reb Chia bar Abba. It says Reb Chia bar Abba, Pershu, Kodem Chatzos, Vechziron Acher Chatzos. It says Reb Chia bar Abba that if Shrirei popped off of the pyre before Chatzos and were returned only after Chatzos, nonetheless, Lo Nenim V'lo Ma'alin, there's no din me'ila. We still say midrabbanan don't get benefit from them, but there is no din me'ila. Prior to Chatzos, there would be a din me'ila. Post Chatzos, even if they weren't at the pyre, clock strikes 12, it doesn't matter. There will be no longer a din me'ila for these Shrirei. V'chein Tana bar Kapara, and so did bar Kapara teach. Bar Kapara was a Tana, the end of the Tanaim. And he taught, Pershu Kodem Chatzos, that if Shrirei popped off of the pyre before Chatzos, Vechzirin la'achar Chatzos, and they were returned after Chatzos, Yotzin Mide Me'ila, there is no longer any din Me'ila. I'm going to drink a shtickle water. It's 2 a.m, friends. It's 2 a.m. This daf took ages to learn and review and all that stuff. Amar le Rav Papa le Abaye, Says a papa to Abai. I started learning. I started yesterday. On Yutes Kislev, I started a Tanya Chavusa. We learn. It's 2 in the morning. My Chavusa is coming over at 10 minutes to 6. I have a Chavusa in 3.5 hours. I haven't even finished recording the daf, let alone recording it and maybe getting a wink of sleep. Oh my gosh. Zevachim, it's something else, huh? All right. Yeah, you can hear my voice. It's a little dry. Kuponim. So, Perish Kodem Chazas. So, where am I? V'chein Tana by Kapar. Oh no, I'm up to Omer Le Rapapa Abai. Says Rapapa to Abai. V'chimi Arad the Shalchu Mitam. Ilchzak Rav Yosef. Says Rapapa to Abai. No, they sent from Eretz Yisrael to Babble that the halacha is like Rav Yosef. V'Omer B'chir Ba'aba. And so says Rav B'chir Ba'aba. V'chein Tani by Kapara, and even by Kapara, the Tana taught like Rav Yosef, that comes chatzos even if the Shrirei are not at the top of the mizbeach, there would no longer be a dimeilah. So Rabbi Rav Yosef, my pligis, then what? So then, what's the deal with Rabbi and Rav Yosef? Rabbi and Rav Yosef, where we're arguing about the same thing. The Shrirei pop up before chatzos and are put back on the pyre post chatzos. How do we handle it? What do you mean? How do we handle them? Seems that it's settled. There's no longer a din milah. And yet, Rabbah says, wait till Chatzos tomorrow. Rav Chizda says, wait till Amud HaShachar. What about Shalchu Mitam from Eretz Yisrael? What about Rav Chia bar Abba? What about Bar Kapara? So, Omar Lei Bishmeinim. So, Abai responds to Rapapa. They are talking about when the Shrirei are fatty. They're shmeinivdik. They're fatty. That when they are fatty, so then we wouldn't just simply consider them all good comes chatzos, no matter where they are. You should put them back on the pyre because they're still fatty until either tomorrow night chatzos according to Rabbah or Amud HaShachar according to Rav Chizda. Okay, Givaldic. And now we move on to the next section of today's daf. The machlok is about if there is linah at the top of the mizbeach. Here we go. Ba mine Rava mirabba. Rava asks his Rebbe Rabba. Rabba had a few Rebbeim. From what comes to mind is Rava's Rebbeim were Rabba, Rav Yosef, Rav Nachman. Am I missing anybody? Anyways, Ba'mine Rava mirabba. Rava asks Rabba, Lina mo'eles birosho shel mizbeach or edom mo'eles birosho shel mizbeach. Okay. Rava asks Rabba. So of course there is the halacha of linah that we've been talking about. On this stuff we've been kind of came up. So what's linah? Linah is if you have, let's say, a korban ola, and you got to burn all the limbs of the ola. You got to do that before Amud HaShachar. Comes Amud HaShachar, if the limbs of the ola are, if we're talking about an ola, so if the limbs of the ola are still lying on the floor of the azar, comes Amud HaShachar, so they are psul belina. They are psul belina. They're not psul. You can't burn them anymore. So the shaila is that if these limbs were at the top of the mizbeach, even if they're not yet, even if they weren't put on the pyre of the mizbeach, but they are at the top of the mizbeach, comes Amud HaShachar, would they be psul belina? Is the psul of lina only on the floor of the azar, or even at the top of the mizbeach? Maybe there's also lina there as well. So again, Ba'mine Rava mirabba. Rava asks Rabba, Lina mo'eles birosho shamizbeach or ena mo'eles birosho shamizbeach. Is there lina at the top of the mizbeach or not? Hey Chidami, what exactly are we talking about? Ilema delo yardu. If we're talking about where they never were taken down from the top of the mizbeach, well then who cares? What's the nafkamina? Because ashta lanu ba'azara omar dilo yerdu b'rosh Hashem mizbeach mibaya. Right? If we look back to the Mishnah on Daf Pei Dalid, it says, I'm reading the Mishnah on Daf Pei Dalid, Elu im alu lo yerdu halon. The first thing listed in the Mishnah on Daf Pei Dalid, what are the things im alu lo yerdu? That once they're at the top of them, if you brought, you shouldn't bring them to the top of the mizbeach, but if you did, you can leave them there. Halon. If you have, let's say, the limbs of an ola that comes alos hashachar, they were on the floor of the azara, they're psuls linah, you should not be bringing them up to the mizbeach. If you did, you could leave them there. So, if that's the case, even if you say that these limbs that were hanging out at the top of the mizbeach, but not on the pyre, they were never put on the pyre, comes Amud HaShachar, even if you want to say that they're psuls linah, who cares? They're already at Im Alu Lo Yerdu. Don't take them down. Leave them there. Burn them. Right, so again, if they never went down, if they were never taken down from the top of the mizbeach, hashta lanu ba'azara omar delo yerdu. When it comes to lanu ba'azara at the bottom of the mizbeach, if they were then taken to the top of the mizbeach, we say leave them there. If they were already at the top of the mizbeach to begin with, certainly they just stay there; they could be burnt. Ve'ela diyardu. Okay, rather it's talking about where they were taken down. So, comes Amud HaShachar, you have these limbs of, I'm talking about a Korban Ola today. Imagine the pyre also refers to other Emurim as well. Let's just talk about Korban Ola. So comes Amud HaShachar, the limbs of the Korban Ola were just hanging out at the top of the Mizbeach, but they were never put on the fire of the Mizbeach. So the shaila is, are they psuls linah? What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is that what if they were now taken down from the top of the mizbeach? If they're psuls linah, then they cannot be brought back up because they're psuls. If there's no psul linah, well then sure, bring them back up. There's nothing wrong with them. So lishulchan midaminan law, do we consider the mizbeach to be like the shulchan? Ditnan, about which we say in a Mishnah in Masechta Menachos about the shulchan where the showbreads were. Afilu ein ala shulchan yomim rabim, that even if the showbreads were, I think actually this is a reference to the bazichen. I think there's actually a reference to the bazichen. Actually, I think, and the showbreads, I'd have to double check that. What does Rashi say? Okay, Victor is a bazichen. I think this might actually be talking about bazichen. Anyways, so even if they are on the shulchan for plenty of time. So this is talking about, so normally the lechem apanim would be switched every Shabbos, and the bazichen, the frankincense that would be hanging out at the top of the lechem apanim, would be brought to the mizbeach achitzon and burnt there. Now, what if the bazichen were only put on the lechem apanim on Sunday? They have to be there for a full week. So comes next Shabbos, you wouldn't be able to burn the bazichen because they weren't yet there for a whole week. But at the same time, you're not going to burn them next Sunday because they have to be burnt on Shabbos. So they're going to basically wait till the following Shabbos, an additional 6 days. But nish gefährlich, it's not a big deal, because as the Mishnah says, afilu ein ala shulchan yom rabim, even if they spend plenty of extra time on the shulchan, it's no problem. Ein b'chach klum, no problem. So do we say the same thing by the mizbeach, that you have these limbs at the top of the mizbeach? No problem, as long as they're hanging out on the mizbeach, there is no problem. There's no iser linah. As long as they're at the top of the mizbeach, they are fine. There's no linah. Or maybe do we consider limbs resting at the top of the mizbeach the same way that we consider limbs resting on the floor of the azar? So Amalei ein linah moeles b'rosh mizbeach, says Rabbah, there's no linah at the top of the mizbeach. No linah at the top of the mizbeach. I guess that means that we consider it like the shulchan. But anyways, there is no linah at the top of the mizbeach. Comes amud hashachar, any limbs that were at the top of the mizbeach are still kosher. Kibla minei olo, did Rava accept this ruling of Rabba or not? Rabba had said that there's no din linah at the top of the mizbeach. Did Rava accept that ruling? Tashmaka manir. The Idmar was stated a varim shalanu ba'azar. So if you have limbs in the azara and it's getting late, mikadesh olech kol halayla. So so long as it's still the nighttime, so long as it's pre-amud hashachar, you can burn these limbs. Okay, so you have limbs in the azara all night. You can bring them to the top of the mizbeach to burn them. Lanu barosh shel mizbeach comes amud hashachar. If you have these limbs are at the top of the mizbeach, but they haven't yet been burned, meqadesh lo'olam, you can burn them forever, right? So if the limbs of the ola were brought to the top of the mizbeach, once at the top of the mizbeach and they stay there, burn them whenever you want. Yardu, what if they were taken down from the top of the mizbeach? Okay, so comes amud hashachar, they're at the top of the mizbeach, they weren't yet burned. What if now you take them down from the top of the mizbeach? Can you bring them back up? Of course, the big nafkamina is, are they possible linah or not? If they're possible linah, once you take them down, you can't bring them back up. If they are not possible linah and they're still kosher, well then, even if you brought them down, you can bring them back up. Rabba Amar Yailu. Rabba says, as he said earlier, there's no psul linah barosh mizbeach. So even if you take them down the next day, bring them back up, they're completely kosher. Rava Omer lo Yailu. Rava, however, disagrees and says, don't bring them back up. Shmamina lo kibla mine. Shmamina, so we see that Rava did not accept the ruling of Rabba, and instead Rava held that there is linah at the top of the mizbeach, and therefore, if the limbs were taken down from the mizbeach the next day, they can't be brought back up. Okay, so we saw there a machlokes between Rabba and Rava about is there linah at the top of the mizbeach. Rabba says no. Rava says yes. The Mishnah had said mizbeach meqadesh v'chulei. The Mishnah had said that just like the mizbeach is meqadesh es haroila, as we learned in the first Mishnah of the Perek. We also said just like the mizbeach is meqadesh, so is the ramp, the kevesh of the mizbeach, and so are Klei Shrirei. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hanogeh b'mizbeach. So anything that touches the, right, the pasuk says, Kol hanogeh b'mizbeach yikdash. I think that's the pasuk. Yeah. Kol hanogeh b'mizbeach yikdash. Anything that touches the mizbeach becomes holy. Any other mizbeach, okay, fine. So anything that touches the mizbeach becomes holy. Kevish minayin. How do we know that the same is true for the ramp? Talmud Omer es amizbeach. There's a few different psukim that say es amizbeach, and es is coming to include not just the mizbeach but also the ramp. Klei minayin. And how do we know that vessels, that service vessels of the temple, anything that goes in them becomes holy, kadosh? It says by the Klei that anything that touches them will become holy. Okay, so the mizbeach is meqadesh is haroila, so is the kevesh, and so are Klei. We now have a brief discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about Klei being meqadesh psuls, that are put in them. But Rish Lakish asks Rabbi Yochanan, Klei Sharis maushi kadros psulin, are Klei Sharis meqadesh psulin? Now, Rabbi Yochanan thought that Rish Lakish was asking about one thing. He was actually asking about another thing, which we'll see. But what Rabbi Yochanan thought Rish Lakish was asking was, can you be podeh psuls once they're in a Klei Sharis? Meaning, so if you have a korban mincha, for example, a flower offering that is tameh, so you can be poded. If you have a flower offering, it became tameh, so just transfer its kedusha onto something else, and then, I guess probably money, and then the flower offering is no longer kadosh and it's Sruli. So Rabbi Yochanan thought that what Rish Lakish was asking was that what if this flower offering, however, was put into a Klei Shares, do we say that now you can't be podeit anymore because now it's been put in a Klei Shares, it's kadosh, kedusha saguf, you can't be podeit anymore. That's what Rabbi Yochanan thought he was being asked. So again, but Rish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, Klei Shares, ma'ashi katras psulin. So if you have, for example, a mincha that is tameh, and you can redeem it, but then it was put in a Klei Shares. The question is the flower now kadosh to the extent that it can't be redeemed anymore? Amarle Tnisu, says Reb Yochanan. Well, it says in our Mishnah, just like the mizbeach and the kevesh or meqadesh, that which is right for them, so are the Klei Shares. So yes, the Klei Shares will be meqadesh, the flower, you can't be podeit any longer. Amar lei. However, Rish Lakish clarifies, no, what I'm asking is, once a psul goes into a Klei Shares, can it now be offered lichatchila on the mizbeach? I imagine you could apply that to the case of the mincha. So if you have the mincha, the flower offering, that's tameh, and then it is put in a Klei Shares, the fact that it became kadosh b'Klei Shares, can I now take a kometz from that, or even, let's say, if it's a flower offering that's entirely burnt in the mizbeach, can this flower offering now be burnt on the mizbeach? Is it kosher milichatchila? Hanami tanina, to which Rabbi Yochanan says, well, this is also in our Mishnah. Shekiblu psulin vizarku ezdamu. That the Mishnah had talked about, where is it? Probably in Daf Pei Daled. Let's see, what does it say in Daf Pei Daled? Where is it? Where actually was this? Oh, there it is. There it is, right at the beginning of the Mishnah. And Daf Pei Daled in the Mishnah, so these were examples of, you shouldn't be putting it on the top of his back, but im lo yerdu. So the Mishnah had said that if you have a korban and let's say a zar did kabbalah sadam, so now it says shekiblu psulin vizarku ezdamu. My love shekiblu psulin vizarku psulin. So Rabbi Yochanan says, no, what is this Mishnah talking about? Well, it's saying that the issue is not just that a zar, let's say, received the blood, but also that he then went and did the zrikas dam as well. That's the issue. That's why, that's why the korban should not be brought on top of his mizbeach, because not only did the zar do the kabbalah sadam, but also the zrikas sadam, implying that if a kosher person would have done zrikas sadam, it would have been fine. Right? Again, the issue is that the zar did the kabbalah sadam and the zrikas sadam, implying that if the zar did kabbalah sadam, but then a kosher person, a kayin, did the zrikas sadam, it would be fine. So what do we see? That the blood that was in the Klei Shares, even though it was received by the zar, it's kosher. So Rabbi Yochanan wants to say that, I guess applying it back to, let's say, the case of the mincha is tamei, but it's put in the Klei Shares, it's kosher to put on the mizbeach milichatchila. Lo shekiblu psulin inami shizarku psulin. Rish Lakish pushes back and says that's not necessarily right from our Mishnah, because you could say that our Mishnah is talking about, no, it's saying either or. That kilu, if either a zar did kabbalah sadam, or even if a kohen did kabbalah sadam, but the zar did zrikas sadam, either way, you could say that what the Mishnah is saying, it should not be offered on the mizbeach. If it was, so then beseder imal lo yerdu. But we're saying that the korban shouldn't be put on the mizbeach. So therefore, Reish Lakish says you can argue that from our Mishnah, it's saying that the klisharis would not allow psuls to be offered in the mizbeach milichatchila. Okay. All right, so it sounds like it's a little bit inconclusive there. Okay. Friends, and now we move on to the fourth and final section of today's daf, the airspace of the mizbeach. You can add two words here, ibayalu. They asked a question. Now says the Gemara, of your mizbeach kamizbeach dami o lo. Is the airspace of the mizbeach like being on the mizbeach itself or not? So now the Gemara, we'll read it in a second inside, but I'll say it outside first. The Gemara makes a very interesting point to argue that the airspace of the mizbeach is like the mizbeach itself, right? So we had said that if you have like a psul, let's say a korbanola is tameh, and it was put on the top of the mizbeach, so we're saying the mizbeach is meqadesh. Fine. So now the question is, what if it's on the airspace of the mizbeach? So now, interestingly, the Mishnah had also said that not just the mizbeach is meqadesh, but the kevesh is also meqadesh. The ramp is also meqadesh. Meaning, if you have the limbs of a korban ola and it's tameh, and they're put on the ramp of the mizbeach, they're placed down on the ramp of the mizbeach. So the ramp of the kevesh will be meqadesh the limbs. Now, what does that mean? You're not going to be leaving the limbs on the ramp, obviously, right? The goal is to get it to the top of the mizbeach so that they can be burned to the top of the mizbeach. How are you going to get it from the ramp? Right? You put down the limbs on the ramp of the mizbeach of the mizbeach. How are you going to get them from the ramp to the top of the mizbeach? Well, you'll probably pick them up and bring them to the top of the mizbeach. So now that's the interesting part. Getting the limbs from the ramp to the top of the mizbeach. What are you going to do? You have to pick them up. When you're picking them up, they're no longer resting on the kevesh. They'll be in the avir of the kevesh, the airspace of the kevesh. They're no longer resting on the kevesh. So the interesting thing is that if you say that the airspace of the ramp is not like the ramp, or slash kilu, if you say that the airspace of the mizbeach is not like the mizbeach, so then what would follow is that the airspace of the ramp is not like the ramp either. Which would mean that you have the limbs of this tameh, right, the tameh limbs of an ola. You put them down on the ramp of the mizbeach. The ramp of the mizbeach is meqadesh them. Okay. But then what's going to happen is that when you pick them up, if you say that the airspace of the ramp is no longer like the ramp, well then, for all intents and purposes, they were just yored. They were just taken off of the ramp. And we know that it once, right, Kashem she'im alu lo yerdu, im yardu lo yailu. We said, right, that if they're taken down from the mizbeach, don't put them back up. So once the limbs are put on the ramp, you're now going to have to get them to the top of the mizbeach. But how are you going to get them to the top of the mizbeach? Because once you pick them up to take them to the top of the mizbeach, you won't actually be able to take them to the top of the mizbeach because it'll be considered like they've already been taken down. Because once they were in the airspace of the kevesh, it's like they're no longer kadosh anymore. It would be like they're yerdu, so how can you be yailu? You hear the question? So Tashma, come in here. I'm going to drink a shtick of water for a second. Kishem mizbeach meqadesh kach kevesh meqadesh. Just like the mizbeach is meqadesh, that which is put the psuls things that are put on it. So is the ramp. But now but if you're going to argue that the airspace of the mizbeach is not like the mizbeach, well then avir kevesh nami lav ki kevesh dami. Well then we'll have to say the same thing about the ramp. In which case, kind of what's the point of saying that the ramp is meqadesh esaroila? Because practically speaking, how are you going to get things from the ramp to the mizbeach? Heichi masikle mikevesh the mizbeach. How can you then take these limbs that are kadosh from the ramp and take them up to the top of the mizbeach. Havale yarud. Once you pick them up, if you say that the airspace of the ramp is no longer like they're on the ramp anymore, it's like you took them off the ramp. How can you now bring them to the mizbeach? Im yarud lo yaila. Dinagadle. You drag it up the mizbeach. You didn't pick it up. You put it down on the kevish, and you drag it up the kevish. You never picked it up. It was never in the airspace of the kevish. It was always resting on the kevish, on the ramp. Okay, perfect the Gemara. Ve'over yesh bein kevish lamizbeach. So I actually made a little diagram over here. It's a very raw diagram. Drink a little more water. My throat is getting dry. It's a very raw diagram. It's not to scale or anything like that. I just put it together quickly just to be able to make, just so we could see what we're talking about over here. So what we're looking at here is in blue is the mizbeach, and in gold is the ramp leading to the top of the mizbeach. Now, as we learned earlier in the Masechta, there is a slight gap between the ramp and the mizbeach. As the white arrow is pointing to, there is a slight gap. So when you get to the top of the ramp, there is going to be a slight gap between the ramp and the top of the mizbeach. Now, but the thing is that, the ramp, as you could see, kind of there's the yesod at the bottom of the mizbeach. There's the sovev kind of towards the top of the mizbeach. These are kind of 1 amma ledges that are jutting out. So there's a 1 amma ledge at the bottom of the mizbeach. There's a 1 amma ledge at the sovev towards the top. And the ramp, kind of like, there are notches in the ramp to accommodate them. The point being that if you look where the white arrow is pointing, where there's that little gap between the kevesh and the mizbeach, that gap is above the sovev. Right? If you were to drop something into the gap, it would land on the ledge of the sovev. The point being that it's the over mizbeach. The gap is the over mizbeach. Which means that even if you're dragging the meat up the ramp, at a certain point, it's going to be going over the gap. And the gap is the over mizbeach. So if you consider the over mizbeach to be like the mizbeach, then it's on the mizbeach the whole time. But if you consider the over mizbeach not to be like the mizbeach, well then even if you drag the meat up the ramp, once it gets to the gap between the ramp and the mizbeach, if you say the over is not like the mizbeach, so then it would be like you're taking it down from the mizbeach. How can you then drag it from the ramp onto the mizbeach if the over mizbeach is not like the mizbeach? Right, so over yesh bein kevish mizbeach. So what about the fact that there is that space between the ramp and the mizbeach? Rav Gidi, I'm going to link to the slide in the description of the daf so that you can have the slide. If I don't link it, if I forget to link it, just message me. So over yesh bein kevish. So what do we do about the space between the ramp and the mizbeach? Okay, here's what we do about the space. What we do is, rubo la kevesh kikevesh, rubo la mizbeach. Look, it's a very small gap. It's a very small gap between the ramp and the mizbeach. Now, as you're schlepping the meat up the ramp, as long as the majority of the limb is still on the ramp, so it's considered like it's still on the ramp. Once the majority of the limb is on the mizbeach, it'll be considered like it's on the mizbeach. At no point would it be considered like it's in the avir hamizbeach. Again, ruba la kevish kevish. So long as the majority of the limb is still on the ramp, it will be considered like it's on the ramp. Ruba la mizbeach kamizbeach, and as long as the majority of the limb is on the, and once the majority of the limb is on the mizbeach, it's considered like it's on the mizbeach. Tifshot me'ah. Well, if this is the case, it seems like we should therefore have an answer to Rami Bar Chama's question then. Because he asked a question and we didn't have an answer. Is this a possible answer? Yeshchibur la'olin olo. Do we say that when you have a limb that's a majority on the mizbeach, that we can consider the rest of the limb to be to be on the mizbeach as well? That it's all considered connected to the limb that's on the mizbeach. So tifsho tiyeshchibur. let's say that yes, right? We're saying from here that once a majority of the limb is on the mizbeach, it's considered like it's entirely on the mizbeach. So it seems like we should therefore have an answer to Ram Bachama's question. That when you have a majority of a limb on the mizbeach, can the rest of the limb be considered like it's on the mizbeach? It sounds like yes. So alo kasha tifshot. So we say, okay, yeah, no problem. Okay, yeah, sure. Say that this could be a proof to argue that there is chibur, and that the limb would be considered like it's on the mizbeach. Maskif la Rabba bar Rav Chanan. Okay. Now, Rava bar Rav Chanan. Rava bar Rav Chanan now asks the following question against the notion of Avir Mizbeach being like the Mizbeach. He says, because if you say that Avir Mizbeach is like the Mizbeach, you run into the following problem. If you say that the airspace of the mizbeach is like the mizbeach, olas ha'of de mifsla b'machshava heichi mishkachas lo hakalta mizbeach. Interesting question, and the question is the following: in olas ha'of. Now, I'm not when he says that. So does he say here? So in olas ha'of is at the top of the mizbeach. Also of the parts of machshava, so it doesn't say it's specific, but an olas ha'of is at the top of the mizbeach. The olas ha'of is at the top of the mizbeach. Now in olas ha'of really I think is on the sovev at the southeastern corner of the sovev. I think. However, if there was too much room at the southeastern side corner of the sovev, then he would do it at the southwestern side, and then it would actually mamish be at the top of the mizbeach, I believe. So I don't know if that's what we're referring to. Are we referring to a olas ha'of that was offered at the top of the mizbeach? Are we saying that offering where it's supposed to be at the southeastern corner, standing on the sovev, is considered the top of the mizbeach? I'm not exactly sure. However, the fact of the matter is, whichever one it is, we are considering that the olas ha'of is being processed, let's call it, by the kohen at the top of the mizbeach. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Chutz lizmano, pigel. In order to have chutz lizmano, pigel, when it comes to burning, right, the olas ha'of, and olas ha'of is going to be burnt on the mizbeach. Now, what's chutz lizmano in terms of burning the olas ha'of? If he has intention when he's doing malika that he's going to burn the olas ha'of, he's going to burn this bird outside of its allotted time. The thing is, if we say that the Avir Mizbeach is like the Mizbeach itself, there isn't actually any past its allotted time. It's always its allotted time. Today, tomorrow, the next day, because the olas ha'of is being processed at the top of the Mizbeach. And if we say that the Avir Mizbeach is like the Mizbeach, well then it's considered like the olas ha'of the entire time, at the time of Malika already, is considered like it's on the Mizbeach. And if it's considered like it's on the Mizbeach, well then you can always burn it on the fire. Even if you want to say like Rava that there is linah at the top of the mizbeach, again, as long as it's on the top of the mizbeach and doesn't go down, as long as it's on the mizbeach, burn it whenever you want. Burn it today, burn it tomorrow. So there isn't any actual time where it would be possible for chutz lizmano, because any time it's time to burn it. Burn it today, burn it tomorrow, because it's already at the top of the mizbeach. So if you say that the Avir of the mizbeach is kam mizbeach, well then already from the time of the Malika, it's already considered like the bird is on the top of the Mizbeach. And if it's on the top of the Mizbeach, well then there's no time that's the wrong time to burn it. You can burn it whenever you want. So then how can you have chutz lizmano, machshavas chutz lizmano, in terms of burning the olas ha'of? Again, maskif lo. Rava bar Rav Chanan asks, if you're going to say that the airspace of the mizbeach is like the mizbeach, well then olas ha'of, when it comes to olas ha'of, tipasla b'machshava, that there's pigul for machshavas chutz lizmano in terms of the time to burn it, heichim mishkachas lo. How could such a thing be? How could there be such a thing of chutz lizmano? Hokalto mizbeach. If we say that the airspace of the mizbeach is like the mizbeach, immediately from the time of Melika, it was already on the mizbeach. If it was already on the mizbeach and it stays on the mizbeach, there's no wrong time to offer it. How can you have chutz lizmano? Maskeflo of Shimi Bar Ashi pushes back and says, what do you mean there's no wrong time? Sure, as long as it stays on the mizbeach and never goes down from the mizbeach, there's no wrong time. However, Kigon, for example, Molka, if he says, I'm doing Malika now on this Ola Sa'of, Al Minas, under the condition, Leorida Limachar Vlalosa Vlaktira, I'm doing Malika now on this Ola Sa'of, with the intention that tomorrow I'm going to take it down from the Mizbeach and bring it back up and burn it. In that case, he is having an intention that is chutz lizmano, because at that point it's going to be too late. Because once he takes it down tomorrow, and it was already psuls linah at the top of the mizbeach, once you take it down from the mizbeach, you can't bring it back up. As long as it stays on the mizbeach, sure. Since it's already on the mizbeach, keep it there. But if he has intention that he's going to take it down from the mizbeach tomorrow, he won't then be able to bring it back up, and it'll be past its time. And if he says that he wants to tomorrow take it down and then bring it back up and burn it, well, then it will be chutz lizmano. In fact, the Gemara Anicha l'Ravit. Okay, this makes sense according to Ravit. The Amar linah mo'eles b'oshem mizbeach, who says that there is linah at the top of the mizbeach, and comes the next day, the bird, the olas off is psuls linah, but because it's at the top of the mizbeach, you could still burn it there, because it's already at the top of the mizbeach. But since the intention was to take it down, so then you can't bring it back up, and it'll be chutz lizmano. But el l'Rabba d'Amar ein linah mo'eles b'oshem mizbeach. So, but according to Rabbi the Amar, who says ein linah mo'eles b'oshem mizbeach, so leisa l'machshavto. So according to Rabbi, who says that there is no linah at the top of the mizbeach, which means that the next day he could take it down from the mizbeach, bring it back up to the top of the mizbeach, no big deal, because the bird is completely kosher. Well, then there goes your machshavas chutz lizmano. Well, l'Rabbanan mishkachas, no, that's not a problem either. Kigon de'amar reini molka amanas lo'rida kodem amar hashachar v'lalos l'achar amar hashachar. No, it's also not a problem, because even according to Rabbah, if you take the Ola Sa'of and it's at the top of the Mizbeach, and you do Malika with the intention that you're going to take it down from the Mizbeach before Amud HaShachar, and then bring it back to the top of the Mizbeach after Amud HaShachar, which means that Amud HaShachar was not at the top of the Mizbeach, so then it would be psuls linah, and then it would be too late to burn it. So according to, so that whole question that we said, that if you say that the airspace of the mizbeach is like the mizbeach, well then you can't have chutz lizmano by Ola Sa'of. That's not true. Both according to Rabbah and according to Rava, regardless of what you hold in terms of linah broshim mizbeach, you could find an ukimta where there would be chutz lizmano by Ola Sa'of. And now the Gemara actually turns things around and says, you were busting the chops of Over Mizbeach Ka Mizbeach, but the fact of the matter is, the opposite is problematic. To say that the Over of the Mizbeach is not like the Mizbeach is actually a problem. That the Gemara says, I'll actually take it to the other direction and say, actually, it makes more sense to say that the Over of the Mizbeach is like the Mizbeach. Because if you say that the Over of the Mizbeach is not like the Mizbeach, if the airspace of the Mizbeach is not like the Mizbeach, well then, Chata Sa'of Psula, if you have a Chata Sa'of and it's psuls, how can you make a Chata Sa'of psuls? Easy. First Mishnah of Masechta Zevachim. Machsheves shelo lishma. If you do the malika with the intention of an olas ha'of, so it was shelo lishma. So the chatas ha'of is psul. Okay, but it's at the top of the mizbeach. So therefore, so even though it's psul, but the mizbeach is meqadesh. That's fine. It's at the top of the mizbeach already. But how are you going to do hazo asadam? How are you going to flick the bird to get the blood to sprinkle on the mizbeach? Because once you kind of do the flicking option and you're holding the bird and flicking it, well, then it's going to be in the airspace of the mizbeach. And if you say that the airspace is not like the mizbeach, well, then essentially you took it off of the mizbeach. How can you put it back on? It's psul. Sahavale yarud. When you go to do Hazos Adam for the Chatas Ha'of, it'll be like you're taking it off the mizbeach. Shar psulim hechizar klu, and similarly, other psulim. Right? If you have a korban, like an olas behema, that's psul. How are you going to do Zrikas Adam for that? Right? Hechizar klu, how are you going to do Zrikas Adam? Midama. How are you going to do Zrikas Adam? Because you have to throw the blood. If you're going to be throwing the blood, you're going to have to take it off of the mizbeach, pick it up from the mizbeach to do Zrikas Adam. So Demagalu, well, you don't really take it off of the mizbeach. It's in contact with the mizbeach the whole time. You're not like separating it from the mizbeach to do a flick or a throw. Ha'hazah hi mitzvah, but then that's not hazah. If the olas ha'of, if the chatas ha'of is touching the mizbeach the whole time, you're not actually like taking it away from the mizbeach to flick it. Well, then that's mitzvah. That's pressing. That's not flicking. Hazrika shvichi, and in terms of zrikas adam for an animal, if it's touching the mizbeach the whole time, it's just pouring. That's not throwing. And is that the normal way? Would that really be considered a regular way to do hazah for a chatas ha'of or zrika for an animal? Nah, that's not right. Amr Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, look, idinakadu b'rosh mizbeach achinami ki kamer ditalanu bekanya my take. Says Rav Ashi, we've been viewing this song wrong the whole time. We've been struggling to figure out this sugya of, is the airspace of mizbeach like the mizbeach or not? Because we were assuming the whole time that it's talking about a person picking up and putting down the korban, putting down the limbs on the kevesh, picking up the limbs from the kevesh, getting it to the top of the mizbeach, processing an olas ha'of, chatas ha'of at the top of the mizbeach, picking it up, putting it down. That's not what we're talking about. If you're talking about that, you're going to have a million questions like we've had. What this is talking about is if you take someone like a pulley or something, and you attach with a hook to the meat or something, and you pull it up on the pulley and dangle it over the top of the mizbeach. We're not talking about somebody picking up the meat and carrying it to the top of the mizbeach. We're talking about if you attach it to some kind of rope and pulley, and you literally dangling it above the mizbeach. Is it considered like it's resting on the mizbeach or not? Teku, we say let's go weiter, which we will do tomorrow. Friends, that was Daf Pei Zayin, Daf 87 of Masechta Zevachim, the first section of the Daf. Talked about the Shrirei limbs, not on the pyre at midnight. Clock strikes 12 and the Shrirei limbs have popped off of the pyre and were not on the pyre come midnight. So we said at the end, we saw Rav Yosef, Rav Chia bar Abba, Bar Kapara, they all said that, look, no matter where the Shrirei limbs are at midnight, Lonen and Vlomalin, there will no longer be any din me'ila, but midrabanan, you shouldn't get benefit from them. Now, if they are fatty, so then we saw the machlokes between Rabbah and Rav Chizda. Rabbah had said, put them back on the pyre, and then tomorrow at midnight, they will become considered consumed. Rav Chizda says, put them back on the fire, and at Amud HaShachar will be considered consumed. Okay, that's when they are fatty Shrirei. The next section of today's daf discussed if there is linah at the top of the mizbeach. We saw machlokas Rabba and Rava. Rabba said there is no linah at the top of the mizbeach. Rava said that there is linah at the top of the mizbeach. We then discussed Klei as being meqadesh psuls, that if you have something pusul that was in a Klei sharis, is it now completely kosher? Was the Klei sharis meqadesh it, so now it's kosher to be placed on the mizbeach? We said psuls and Klei sharis are not kosher lichatchila, but im alu lo yerdu. And then we discussed the airspace of the mizbeach. Is it like the mizbeach? Is it not like the mizbeach? The kevesh, is it like the kevesh? Not like the kevesh? In the end, we said, Teku. Friends, that was the Pei Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. I hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers.